Hi, everyone, and welcome back to On the Couch with Dr. Eric. Now, as you all know, we usually categorize our guests in three categories. One is the rising star, two is the rock star, and three are the legends. Now, I know, Eduardo, you'd love to be a rock star, but you fit into the category of a legend. Now, let me say why. Mr. Edward Kuckerman is the founder and managing partner of Catalyst Investments. He serves as the chairman of Kuckerman and Co. Investment House, which is the leading Israeli investment house with offices in Paris, Munich, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Milan, Poland, Singapore. Talk about if you want to have a bucket list of international travel. They've completed over 7 billion in transactions. They have one of the largest corporate finance teams in Israel with dedicated experts in life sciences, technology, media, telecom, just to name a few. Mr. Kuckerman is also an author and a world renowned speaker. Edward, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and Shana Tova to you and to all the audience. I'm very glad to start with so many compliments, but I'd rather be a rising star than a legend. I feel young enough to be
Thank you.
a young entrepreneur still.
Thank you. We'll talk to the team in the back to recategorize that. I wanted to ask you, and Shana Tova to you as well, of course. I wanted to ask you, what is that magic special sauce that makes Israel such a driving force in innovation?
No, I actually wrote a book, as you mentioned, about it. It's called Israel Valley, and explained the key ingredients or key success factors of the Israeli high-tech industry. I think that if I have to mention 7 points, one is education. We have the highest investment per capita in the world in investment in education. The second point, which is the support of the government, which has been helping in indirect ways. For example, they promoted Aliyah. As you probably know, there have been 1 million people that immigrated from the former Soviet Union to Israel. At that time, it was 20% of the population that came to Israel. It's obviously also very highly educated people, as 64% of them came with an academic degree. But the government helps in different ways, obviously through the support they gave to the high-tech companies, financing the R&D through the chips, through different the years. Also, the investments that in military has a major impact, because when you are very young and you are gaining responsibility at a age to lead people, to also using the state-of-the-art technology tools at a very young age, it obviously helped to create the basis that enable us to build the Israeli high-tech industry. Now, also, I think that the fact that Israel is a small nation with only 8 million people, almost 9, but they are not able to develop their activity only locally. So they have to have a global approach. From day one, any startup company will have to think about how they can compete with players overseas, whether it's in Europe, Asia, or in the US. We have also a very particular and vivid venture capital community. When I started my first fund, it was back in '93. We were 3 funds in Israel. Today we are 380 local funds, another 100 international funds. Last year there was more than $8 billion invested by the venture community into the high-tech industry. Just if you compare it to Europe, it's half of what was invested in early-stage companies all over Europe put together. And also, when we speak about access to the global financial market, you know that there have been more than 300 Israeli companies that went public in the US, and more than 100 Israeli companies that went public in Europe. So that's very unique. We have also a very particular entrepreneurial spirit. You know the terminology of chutzpah that
Right.
we have that makes really something very very unique. And I think we have a very pleasant working environment also for international investors. We facilitate investment from overseas by, for example, providing tax exemption for foreign investors at investment funds or in the high-tech
Hmm.
industry. So those are part of the ingredients that make this particular ecosystem in Israel.
Thank you for that. Now, zoning into your organization and your career, you have built a very impressive international organization. Very impressive. How did you go from concept to reality?
Maybe it started because, when I finished my study at the Technion, and after that I did my MBA in Europe in Fontainebleau at INSEAD, nobody wanted to hire me. So that's the first reason I had to create my own firm. And I tried to go into places where there was very little competition. So as I mentioned, I started my first fund back in '93 when we were only three venture capitalists in Israel. It was the beginning of the industry. And when I wanted to take an Israeli company public in Europe, nobody was ready to move to take the risk of going public in Europe because everybody was focusing on the US or on Tel Aviv Stock Exchange.
Hmm.
So as I couldn't find any candidate, I took my own venture fund public in '97 in Europe.
Wow.
It was a very positive experience for me. And then I attracted more and more Israeli companies to go public in Europe. Altogether, there have been 100 Israeli companies that went public there, and we did most of the Israeli IPOs in continental Europe and quite a few in London. So we went to niches where we didn't see much competition. That was we started our activity 27 years ago. So for 20 years, we were focused on Europe.
Hmm.
And the last 10 years, we started building bridges with the China market. So we started raising money in China, especially from our latest fund. We managed to get a local strategic partner called China Everbright that helped us
Hmm.
build a joint fund, which was mostly backed by Chinese investors. And that enabled us to grow our activity and to expand from building a relationship between Israel and Europe, and then Israel and China. So that's the geographies where we didn't feel much competition was going on. And I have to
Hmm.
tell you, I'm very excited that still the UAE market and the Gulf market is still virgin, and that's why we are trying to move fast, and we've already we came with a delegation from our group to
That's
see
incredible.
what we
How
can do in
you,
UAE.
as soon as the news came out, you're there on a flight in the UAE. Tell us about that. How was that experience?
First, in Israel, it's a very competitive market, so you have to be the first mover. It's also answering your first question, but also in UAE, as opposed to other markets where it took many years before we built a real operation. I think UAE, I was overwhelmed with that trip because I think it was one of the best trips I've ever made.
Wow.
Maybe because I think we have much more synergy than maybe in other areas, in other regions. There is maybe some common mentality. We are all from the Middle East. We are
Right.
Semite. We have, I think, a lot to offer one to the other. For example, I was very impressed with the way they hosted us, and also their interest for what's going on in Israel, especially in fields such as food security.
Mm.
Israel has a very similar climate as in some areas, like in the Arava area, in the south of
Hmm.
Israel, as a climate in the UAE. And we have developed a strong agriculture to supply the food to cities like Eilat with local supply.
Hmm.
And they are very interested in building this infrastructure that would be able to provide, for example, the food security that they need. I do think that the UAE has invested a lot in markets such as tourism, obviously aviation, real estate,
Right.
and oil and gas. And those fields have been very much affected in the last period of time, especially since the COVID crisis started. So
Right.
they see also that creating value for the future, they need to look at technologies. And
Right.
Israel is much closer than trying to bring technology from the Silicon Valley. And the Israelis are very keen to develop relationship there. So there is a lot to offer for them. Also, it's an opportunity to access technology that can have an impact for the future. And for us, it's also the UAE could be a hub for the establishment of Israeli companies in all the Gulf countries. So it's really a win-win situation, I believe.
That's very, very impressive. Very impressive. Wanted to ask you our last question. What would your advice be? Because I know you've immigrated to Israel in 1984. I think I was 2 years old back then. Um, what would be your advice to immigrants, to new immigrants to Israel?
First, if you decide to immigrate to Israel, what I've learned from my own experience is that the sooner the better. I see my French friend that 30 years after or 40 years after I immigrate to Israel, say that they want to do it now, and they clearly say it's much more difficult
Right.
when you have to start from scratch. It's better to do it at a younger age.
Mm-hmm.
Another element, I think that there are a lot of ability to get some support with local organizations, not only the Jewish agency, but there are a lot of private organizations that can help. For
Mm-hmm.
example, my partner has been the founder. My partner is Yair Shamir. He has founded a non-profit organization called Gvaim. I was actually on the
Mm.
board of Gvaim, and they help to bring talents to come from all over the world to establish their professional activities in Israel. We have
Wow.
even within Gvaim created an activity which is called the Hive, which is an incubator program for
Hmm.
the young entrepreneurs that would like to establish venture activity in Israel.
Wow.
So that's one example, but there are so many initiatives. I'm on the board of Sarel, which brings volunteers to work in the military bases as civilians, and we see that since the establishment of Sarel, we have hosted above 200,000 volunteers. And
Wow.
many of the youngest people that did Sarel did immigrate to Israel, and it's a way for them to get acquainted with the Israeli culture, to work in an Israeli military base. So
Mm-hmm.
there are many interesting programs like that, which I recommend to follow. And it's important for those that are coming to mix with the local population. For example, when I studied at the time at the Technion,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't stay at the dorms of the new immigrants. I really
Hmm.
stayed with the Israelis. I do
Gotcha.
recommend, for example, I went to the army, and I think it was very helpful, and for all my career and for my integration. I would recommend also to, if you can do it, to serve in the army. If you're too old to do it, maybe you could do just a Sarel program. But these are the type of things that are important to mix with a local culture. You're very, very clearly attempted to work to stay with the population from your own country.
Mm-hmm.
You see, there is a strong French population, for
And
example, in
Netanya. Netanya.
Netanya, in Ashdod,
Right.
in Jerusalem. But I think that the best uh, recommendation I could do is really try to integrate, try to learn the language, and
Mm-hmm.
even though you can manage to speak Hebrew or English or French or Russian and live nicely in Israel, you'd rather learn Hebrew and speak Hebrew very fast.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kukerman, for your time,
My
for all your
pleasure.
efforts, for all the greatness that you do all over the world. Have a Shana Tova Umetuka to you and your
To you,
family.
to you too, and to all the people that are following your program. Thank you very much.